Yes, we are.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you all for taking the time to be with us here today. I know that Gaza and Palestine, Israel at large, can be quite a heavy topic, but it's also an extremely important one with global implications, so we really do appreciate your interest. It's a great honor to introduce to you our two distinguished speakers, Professor Ilan Pappé and Dr. SHIR, HEVER. Ilan Pappé is an Israeli-born historian, professor, author, and political dissident living and teaching in the United Kingdom. He's a fellow of the Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies, director of the European Center for Palestinian Studies, and co-director of the Exeter Center for Ethno-Political Studies. Dr. SHIR, HEVER is an independent Israeli political economist, author, journalist, and the host of the Real News Network. He holds a PhD from the Free University of Berlin. Dr. HEVER's latest book, titled The Privatization of Israeli Security, is available for purchase after the lecture, as well as Professor's book co-authored with Noam Chomsky on Palestine. So if you feel so inclined, feel free to seek those books out after the lecture. Thank you both so much for being here. Before we get started, I'd also like to thank the Palestinian Embassy in Prague, the International Solidarity Movement, and the Society of the Friends of Quakers in the Czech Republic for putting this event together. I'd also like to welcome Mr. Arne Springorum. Sorry about that. He'd like to say a few words about the involvement of the Quaker Society and why they are co-sponsoring this lecture. So,
right now?
Yes, please.
So, I'm a Quaker, and there aren't many Quakers in this part of the world. There are 6 Quakers in the Czech Republic, which is quite normal, actually. We've been around for 350 years. And when Quakers first formed in England, there was quite a stir, because they said, we believe there's that of God in everyone, and that includes Jews and Muslim and anyone else. And that was rejected by the norm at that time. And since then, I think Quakers have stayed true to their convictions, and we've been very much involved in the world, not so much thinking about what comes after life, but what's happening today and what's happened in the past. And Quakers have, in the last century, been distinguished for their help during and after the World Wars in continental Europe. And they were very involved in the Kindertransport. And after the war, they won the Peace Nobel Prize for their efforts of helping. And then they were asked by the newly formed UN if they could help also with the refugee work of the Palestinians. So in 1948, they were very much involved in putting the rescue effort together in Palestine to help refugees there. So when we were asked to co-sponsor this event, I immediately said yes. And that is also maybe because just in recent months, the State of Israel has decided to ban Quaker activists, so we've been blacklisted because of our support of BDS. So I've been myself on a study tour to Israel and to Palestine, and have experienced this situation. I'm really looking forward to your talk tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Arne. So without further ado, let's get the lecture started. Please keep your questions towards the end of the lecture. It'll be followed by a Q&A session. Gentlemen, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. Can you hear us? Great.
It's a great pleasure to be here. The topic is not an easy one, definitely not a comfortable one, but nonetheless a very essential one. I think for many of us, the situation in Gaza is a microcosmos of the situation in Palestine as a whole. And whatever happens in other parts of historical Palestine and among the Palestinian communities outside of Palestine, it seems to be augmented and to be more accentuated in the case of the Gaza Strip. It's if there is something there that sort of amplifies the suffering, amplifies the sense of a deadlock, amplifies the sense of an international apathy and indifference, and amplifies the injustice that occurred and still occurs in the whole of historical Palestine. Because I'm an historian, I offered that in the first lecture that I'm giving before SHIR continues, I will try and give the historical context for the creation of the Gaza Strip, because I think it's very important to understand the historical roots of an issue if you want to deal with the present realities, and definitely if you want to think about future solutions and a way forward. Those of you who are familiar with the history of Palestine would know that Gaza, like all the other Palestinian towns, both benefited and suffered from their geopolitical locations. On the Via Maris, on the road of the sea from Egypt up to the north to Lebanon, Syria, and Turkey. And like all the kind of maritime communities, the Gaza community was both open to cosmopolitical influences from the outside, so many people were going through and coming through, and yet it was always the first station in the march of occupying armies who could have been quite cruel. Napoleon, for instance, stopped in Gaza and massacred the people as an attempt to send a message to the rest of Palestine that they should not try to resist him. So it was kind of a collective act of criminality, one of many that the people of Gaza would suffer alongside that kind of more cosmopolitical, more open kind of ended reality. In 1948, the fortunes of the city of Gaza and the small towns not far away from it and the countryside around it has really dramatically changed. It changed because the Israeli forces that began ethnically cleansing the Palestinian already in February 1948, and for the next 9 months would expel 750,000 of Palestinians and demolish 500 Palestinian villages, half of Palestine's villages, and depopulate 11 Palestinian towns. This Israeli operation, when it was focused on the south later on in the year, from June, July onwards, was looking for a receptacle, for a place to where it could push the Palestinians, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians. Israel wanted to ethnically cleanse from a line, we don't have a map, but you can imagine a line that goes from Jaffa to Jerusalem and to the south. Palestinians who were expelled from the coast in the north, and Palestinians who were expelled from the heart of Palestine were expelled either to the West Bank, or what became the West Bank and Jordan, or Syria, or Lebanon. But you had a huge Palestinian population that was an obstacle for the Israeli plan of de-Arabizing Palestine. So if you look at the lines of the Gaza Strip, it's like a very clear kind of boundaries drawn with a pencil and a ruler. And the reason is that this is the way the Israelis decided to create this huge mega refugee camp to which they have pushed the people of Jaffa and everything south of Jaffa. And of course, in one night, the population, the pastoral population of the city and the surrounding towns and countryside doubled and then tripled. And the infrastructure that was meant to cater for 100, 150,000 people suddenly had to cater for 500,000, if not more, of people. It is one of these places, by no means the only place, where if the world would have taken, would have paid attention to what was happening in Palestine in the name of peace, in the name of redemption, of the suffering of the Jews in Europe, if the people would have paid attention just to this part of Palestine, which is 2% of historical Palestine, that's all. In that area, in the second half of 1948, many of the atrocities that would be repeated again and again after that against the people of Palestine were already committed then, when they have turned this part of Palestine into a huge mega refugee camp. And it's not surprising that there, not only there, but there in particular, refugees were what could watch their former fields, their former homes, the former businesses turned into either Jewish settlements or being recreated as recreational parks. Israel planted European pine trees on the ruins of the village because they didn't like the Arabic landscape. They didn't like, they wanted the land to remind them of Europe. They didn't want it to look like an Arab country. But the proximity between being in a refugee camp in Gaza and being able to watch what's happening to your house, to your home, to your field, is something that explains the motivation in those refugee camps to resurrect the Palestinian liberation movement, to resurrect the national struggle, and to turn Gaza into one of the centers that wants to say to the world, despite the catastrophe of the destruction of Palestine and the Palestinian, the struggle goes on. So I think Gaza in 48, 49 deserves our revisiting historically. Deserves our revisiting historically. It sometimes is marginalized compared to other cities, compared to other parts of Palestine. But I think it is important to understand and to tell the world what is the Gaza Strip. Nobody talked about the Gaza Strip in February 1948. The Gaza Strip did not exist. There was the Bersaba kind of administrative area. It was part of the region of the south. And it was part of, it was an integral, organic part of historical Palestine. People had familial connections with other towns, with other communities. And then it becomes a strip. And you know, the word strip is really humiliating in so many ways, because the idea of the strip was that you are taking a slice of the land, but it's actually, this slice becomes a huge refugee camp. And it's not surprising that there, even at the beginning of 1949, there was the first ever attempt to create a government in exile. The old Palestine government was created in Gaza by former Palestinian leaders who were expelled in 1948. And in Gaza, like in everywhere else, a complicated relationship developed between the Palestinian independent national liberation movement and the interest and involvement of the Arab countries. Until today, it's a very uneasy relationship. In this particular case, it was Egypt. And I think we should also revisit the Gaza Strip in the days of Jamal Abdel Nasser. This Egyptian leader was demonized so much in Western scholarship, in the collective memory of a lot of people. I think he deserves a revisit. And we should look again at his commitment to the Palestine issue, remembering that he fought for Palestine, became a prisoner of war in Palestine. He did many things which not all of us agree, especially on the left, but we should understand that part of what he did in Gaza was not only to take over a Palestinian interest for the sake of his own interest or Egyptian interest. I think there was something there that belongs to an age of solidarity, both regional and international solidarity, where Gaza was a very important focal point for this, that I hope we will be able to resurrect in the future. Because the Middle East needs the kinds of international solidarity the world, especially the third world, had with the Palestinian struggle in the 60s and the 70s, when in the United Nations, people were talking about decolonization as a positive idea, of breaking down colonialist monopoly as the right thing to do. And yet, so many people were decolonized. So many people were liberated from colonialism in the 60s and the 70s of the 20th century. One people were not able to get the international support to complete the work of liberation. So I think we should revisit these periods and also look at it through the eyes of what was going on in Gaza between 1948 to 1967. The next chapter, which I think is really, really important, is the whole Israeli perception of the Gaza Strip once it is occupied in the June 67 war. I think that's really an important turning point in the history of Gaza, which again, as you can understand, for me, reflects the history of modern Palestine altogether. Contrary to the Israeli narrative, the Israeli government contemplated occupying the West Bank and the Gaza Strip long before the June 67 war. The kind of events in June 67 enabled Israel to occupy these parts of Palestine, 22% of historical Palestine, that it did not occupy in 1948. First, because it had a secret agreement with Jordan to give it the West Bank in return for a very limited Jordanian involvement in the 48 war, and it didn't occupy the Gaza Strip because it needed this refugee area to create. But in 67, a different kind of political elite in Israel emerges, which regards both the West Bank and the Gaza Strip as the part of the ancient land of Israel that strategically and ideologically has to be taken over. And we now have access to the Israeli documents, the government documents from the immediate days after the 67 war. And the discussions about the Gaza Strip are really illuminating. They're not an easy read. In fact, it's quite harrowing to read the way Israeli politicians talked about Gaza and the people. But it tells you something about the present. It tells you about the present. There was a consensus among Israeli policymakers that the West Bank has to be forever under either direct or indirect Israeli control. There were debates whether there was a need for direct or indirect, and there was also a consensus that some sort of Jewish colonization in the West Bank has to be activated. Again, there were different ideas where to colonize, where not to colonize, but there seemed to be quite a clear idea that the West Bank entering the West Bank is an act of redemption, not an act of occupation. And then they created a peace process that falsified this, or kind of tried to hide this basic Israeli strategy towards the West Bank that I think has never changed, and I don't think there's much of a difference between the various Israeli political parties about the West Bank. They all deem it as part of the land of Israel. They have different tactical ideas of how to control it, and different ideas of what to do with the people who live there. But there were serious debates about the Gaza Strip. The first impulse of almost everyone involved in the Israeli government in '67 was to kick out the people of Gaza, to depopulate the Strip, partly by moving people to the West Bank, partly by moving them to Egypt or Jordan. And then came the realization, because these were people who did ethnic cleansing in '48, so they thought it's possible to do it again, came the realization that 1967 is not 1948. A, there was no war anymore. You couldn't justify it by an act of war. Secondly, there was television around, which wasn't there in '48. And thirdly, There was a realization, actually, you're going to kick out people who you already kicked out. Refugees, there was a worrying kind of analysis that the army would now face real resistance for a second kind of expulsion by people who had already been expelled in 1948. But the adjectives, Israeli politicians, including for what is called the Israeli left, the liberal or the socialist, it doesn't matter, the adjective used to describe the people of Gaza, I don't want to repeat them, but these are adjectives from the world of animals, from the world of worms, from the world of dirt. It shows you the level of dehumanization that the Zionist policy makers have reached in 1967 when dealing with an issue like Gaza. And dehumanization is very important. We know it from the Nazi period, and we know it from other horrible chapters in modern history. People who do terrible things, commit crime against humanity, against other people, have first to dehumanize the victims. You don't do it to other human beings. You don't regard them as normal human beings. Otherwise, you could not do it. You could not use a sniper rifle against a kid in Gaza unless you thought the kid was not a kid. It was a potential terrorist. He was a potential enemy. And this is something that, as I said, in Gaza is amplified. It was already amplified in the discourse in '67. And then when eventually and very reluctantly the Israeli government said, okay, we'll have to leave the Gaza Strip under our responsibility. They were very worried about it, by the way. Unlike the West Bank, they were really excited of having the West Bank, but they were really troubled. I don't know how many people know it. They were really troubled by the fact that the Gaza Strip would be under Israeli occupation. It's one of the reasons that Yitzhak Rabin later on encouraged Jewish colonization of the Gaza Strip by hoping that this would somehow mitigate, for the Israelis, the problem of Gaza. But if you look at the first Israeli reaction to the first Palestinian resistance in the Gaza Strip for the Israeli occupation, when Ariel Sharon was the commander of the military operation against the people of Gaza, all the brutality that you will later recognize in the Israeli reactions to Palestinian resistance in the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip were already there in '67, '68. Demolition of houses, depopulating whole areas, transferring people. And alongside the barbarity inflicted on the people of Gaza, there was the international silence. It goes together. The international indifference, an inability or unwillingness to use a human rights yardstick to judge the Israeli actions happened in '48 in Gaza, happened in '67, happened in 2006, happened in 2014, and God forbid will happen again if something similar is going to recur in the Gaza Strip. So I think this is why I'm going back to these historical moments. Now, the last chapter before I finish and move to SHIR, which is very important, is to distinguish the moment in which the Israeli political system kind of makes a certain fine-tuning to its basic ideas of what to do with the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. I think they always had a clear idea of, as I said, that they want to control the space and try to isolate them as much as they can from the people. Well, it's because Zionism is a settler colonial movement and Israel is a settler colonial state. Settler colonial states want to have a space without the indigenous people. So how to do it, Israelis all the time sort of try to juggle all the balls because they also want to be recognized as a democracy. And I think generally they want to be a democracy. It's not just a game. They want to be a democracy, but they also want to have the land without the people. And somehow these two ambitions are not easily reconciled. And they are, I think, one of the reasons they are voting for the right is that they are tired of reconciling because it's irreconcilable. You cannot square the circle here. You cannot be a democracy that ethnically cleanses people. You cannot be a democracy that occupies another people. And you cannot be a democracy that perpetrates an incremental genocide in Gaza. It doesn't work. But some of them are still hoping. Most of them are just tired. And they said, okay, let's give up this whole idea of democracy. And I think the Israeli nationality law is a very good indication for this new trend in Israeli politics. But I just want to end up with what I call the fine-tuning in 2005, 2006 with regard to the Gaza Strip, which is the disengagement Israeli program perpetrated by Ariel Sharon. The whole idea was, until 2005, that you can apply the same strategy and policy to the West Bank and to the Gaza Strip. And then it turned out, from a strategic point of view, that you don't need to control the Gaza Strip the same way that you control the West Bank, because the space is different, the composition of the settlers is different. In the West Bank, Israel applies and will apply, and the nationality law says it very clearly, will apply what I will call a kind of incremental partition. All the time, they will partition and partition. A Jewish West Bank, a Palestinian West Bank. The one growing all the time, the other one is being shrunk. They have different ideas what to call the Palestinian West Bank. Could it be a state? Could it be an autonomy? Could it be the greater Ramallah municipality? It doesn't matter. What matters is what is the Jewish space, and what to do with the Jewish space, and what to do with the Palestinians who live in the Jewish space. Can we sort of squeeze them into the Palestinian area of the West Bank? This is a clear strategy, and it doesn't matter who is going to be in government in the next election, they will implement it. I have no doubt about it. Sharon came with the idea that you don't need it in the Gaza Strip. You don't need to partition the Gaza Strip to a Jewish Gaza Strip and a Palestinian Gaza Strip. It's too small. What you should do is take out the settlers, and then you can control by force the Gaza Strip from the outside. And if anybody thinks that from an Israeli point of view, the fact that the Hamas started a kind of a war of resistance against this idea of ghettoizing or enclaving the Gaza is disturbing Israeli policymakers, I'm not sure, but we may talk about it. I don't think the Israeli strategies are very sorry for the fact that what unfolded was a space where they can experiment new weapons. Secondly, they can make sure that the army is not idle. It supposedly is going to war every now and then, and where the damage to the civil society is relatively limited because it's only the development towns around the Gaza Strip that suffer. It's not Tel Aviv, it's not Haifa, it's not the main centers, and therefore it's tolerable. You can kind of, digest that kind of suffering because the dividends are quite clear. I think there is a confusion about the international awakening to the Gaza Strip as a point of critique against Israel, that the West Bank never succeeded in doing this. Something about the ferocity of the brutality of the Israelis in the Gaza Strip that led even traditionally supporters of Israel to ask tough questions about the Israeli identity and policy and so on. I mean, that's where they find it difficult. This is one of the reasons that I think that they're limiting themselves since 2014, because finally they sort of realized that there's a red line there that they don't yet know how to define, but they seem to be crossing the red lines, whereas daily abuse of people in the West Bank is tolerated by the international community. Massive attacks on Gaza may produce problems for the state of Israel. They know that they benefited from the events in Syria and Iraq that distracted attention from the cruelty and the urban side that they did in Gaza, but they know that Syria and Iraq relatively are calmer now. They are not at the center of attention anymore. So an Israeli attack, for instance, a massive attack on Gaza, could again turn Gaza into the main news, which is something the Israelis don't know what to do. To sum up, just to sum up, I think that we should never fragment our attention to Palestine. This is a Zionist game, to fragment the Palestinian reality, to say there's a different Palestine in Gaza, there's a different Palestine in the West Bank, there's a different Palestine in Haifa, there's a different Palestine in the refugee camp, or the exilic community in Prague. This is the greatest success of Zionism, to fragment Palestine geographically, culturally, mentally. I think when we talk, and I understand it's difficult to focus on one part of Palestine and say it deserves more our attention than what's happening in another part of Palestine. But we should always analyze and protest and work to change the reality in one place in Palestine when the whole of Palestine is in our mind and in our hearts. Because otherwise, I think that we are playing into the hands of a project that still wants to de-Arabize the whole of Palestine and to turn it into a purely Jewish state. This is one of the reasons that I think that even genuine believers in the two-state solution should rethink whether this is not falling into the hands of the fragmentation of Palestine as a Zionist plan and does not help us to bring an end to the injustice and colonization in historic Palestine as a whole. I think I'll stop here. I didn't look at the watch. Is it already morning? Did I speak like Castro for 7 hours? Or I have no idea for how long I spoke, but nobody died. Only 3 people fell asleep. So that's not a bad, end product. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ilan. It's a great honor to speak after you. And of course, you made my work much easier by giving such a broad and in-depth analysis of the historical events that lead us to the situation today. So I can just allow myself to jump into the present after the history is now clear. But I really want to start, and also thank you for making some points that I think we in our previous discussions we also found some disagreement between us. So maybe a little bit of disagreement will also wake up the audience a bit. So I think one of the I want to really start with the point that you finished on how we have to be careful about not to fragment our conception of the Palestinian territory. Or the Palestinian space, and I think there is actually no distinction between what you said before about the problem of dehumanization and the use of these abusive adjectives and the logic of fragmentation, which is the same thing. If we focus constantly on the atrocities committed against Gaza, we are also taking away the subjectivity of the people in Gaza. And I've even heard Palestinian activists who say that Gaza has turned people into laboratory animals. The metaphor is horrifying. Of course, they're not laboratory animals, they're human beings. How do we avoid that? I think even though both of us, we come from an Israeli background, we are analyzing the Israeli society and the Israeli policy, we're not analyzing the Palestinian side. But nevertheless, I think that through analyzing the Israeli side, I can see, and I hope that I will be able to convince you, that the Palestinians in Gaza are able to make their voice heard and are able to change Israeli policy, and even under the conditions of siege, are able to change their own reality. They are not powerless, and I will explain. I think I also have to say something about the fact that we have an election in Israel in about 3 weeks. Just look at the topic of Gaza in the Israeli elections this year compared to the 2015. In 2015, the previous election in Israel, I thought Gaza is the most important issue for Israeli politics, for the Israeli policy. It was the most important issue affecting the global boycott movement against Israel. It was an extremely expensive issue for the Israeli budget. Not even one Israeli political party mentioned the word Gaza in any of their election propaganda campaigns or even on their platform on their website. No one. Not the pro-occupation, not the anti-occupation. Not Netanyahu and not his opponents. Not Labour and not Likud. No one. Look at the election today and you see that the word Gaza starts to appear in several places, usually, of course, as the enemy that must be defeated, but cannot be ignored. Cannot be ignored, and that's something different. I want to look at the relationship between the Israeli policy and the resistance movement in Gaza in a metaphor of a kind of arms race. An arms race between two sides. And I think it's an interesting metaphor because if we really look at it in a critical way, we see that the Palestinians are winning the arms race. How is it possible that Palestinians are winning the arms race against Israel? I think maybe this is the point that you're jumping already. I will try to convince. So I want to start my story actually with, not in Gaza, but in Hebron in 2016 in May, when Elor Azaria, an Israeli sergeant, murdered Abdel Fattah al-Sharif by shooting him in the head. It was a very famous story, and I think some of you know this story. It was a story that completely changed the way that the Israeli military functions and the discussion in Israel about policy towards Palestinians. This was a story where the fact that an Israeli soldier murders a Palestinian is not news, unfortunately. This is a completely routine affair. But an Israeli soldier who does that in front of the camera by disobeying orders, killing a Palestinian who was clearly not a threat to anyone, and doing that while in front of an audience, and then he was arrested, triggered a very strong debate in the Israeli public. Normally, when a soldier is doing that, the lawyers of the army would immediately tell him, look, all you have to do, say that you felt threatened, and you will not go to jail. Elor Azaria said, no, but I didn't feel threatened. I refuse to take that line of defense. My line of defense is different. I am Jewish, he's Palestinian, I can kill him if I want. This is now the whole colonial history of the Israeli society exploding into reality. And Elor Azaria was also saying it has a lot to do with the fact that I am Mizrahi, a Jew of Arab origin, and when Ashkenazi Jews are Jews that originate from Europe, like myself, if they, like Ashkenazi pilots, bomb a whole neighborhood in Gaza and kill hundreds of people, nobody arrests them. Why should I be arrested for killing one? Right? The right to kill Palestinians should be given to all Jews equally. It is, of course, a very, very difficult subject for us to discuss, but for the Israeli public, it's something that changed the concept of military discipline, because there was a whole movement that started to support Elor Azaria. There were demonstrations supporting him. The Minister of Defense said, we want a military that obeys orders. We cannot have soldiers make their own rules. And if we do, then our army will become beastly. Use the word beastly, like animals. So Elor Azaria and his family said, you're using the word beastly because Elor Azaria is Mizrahi. This is a racist statement, right? Because you're comparing Mizrahi Jews to animals. And the Minister of Defense had to resign. And at that moment, Israeli officers started to have doubt if they have the ability to command their own soldiers. Now I'm moving back to Gaza. Since March 30th, which is Land Day in Palestine, of 2018, Palestinians started the Great March of Return. It was a movement that started by about 20 civil society organizations. And I think that the Palestinians who organized the Great March of Return understand Israeli society better than most Israelis understand it. They realized exactly what is this problem of discipline that is happening in the Israeli army. They decided to organize this non-violent, unarmed demonstration every Friday, and they're doing it until today, more than a year, even though it looks to the outside onlooker as if they are committing suicide. The Israeli soldiers go there with sniper rifles and shoot in the head the protesters one after the other, and they continue to protest every Friday. Why are they doing that? I think they understand exactly the context of their protest much better than most Israelis can understand. Because they understand that their form of protest is challenging the whole program of the Israeli military industry and the whole system of justification that the Israeli government uses in order to allow the use of violence against people in Gaza. These demonstrations are a great challenge both to the Fatah party and to the Hamas party. The Fatah party and President Mahmoud Abbas of Palestine have tried to punish the people in Gaza and to tell the Israeli government to stop providing electricity to Gaza and money and things like that. Not that the Israeli government ever delivered any money to Gaza, but sometimes allow foreign donors to provide it. But at the same time, the Hamas party is calling on armed struggle against the Israeli military, which is stronger. And it is a very daunting task to go to war with a modern military with tanks and airplanes when your weapons are basically very inferior. So the people who organized the Great March of Return, they understand that they are challenging both of these parties, and they were able to put at least the Hamas party in a corner up to the point that Hamas party decided to endorse the demonstrations, even though it is a direct challenge to Hamas. Who needs Hamas if the best protest is nonviolent? Hamas' entire mode of explaining themselves to the public is to say only with weapons we can liberate ourselves. So now they're supporting a nonviolent protest. It puts them in an impossible situation. But let's look at the Israeli side, what started to happen with the Great March of Return. Social media started to fill up with reports of Israeli soldiers who were saying, we refuse orders. We, for example, were kicked out of our unit because we refuse orders. And we don't want to go and participate in those units of snipers that are trying to stop the Great March of Return. All of these refuseniks, we think about the Israeli soldier refuseniks usually as people from the left who don't want to kill Palestinians. No, they were from the right. Those were Israeli soldiers who were saying, I got a command from my officer that I have to use non-lethal means, like rubber-coated bullets, to shoot Palestinians instead of live ammunition. I refused. I prefer not to be a soldier at all. Some soldiers who said, you have to go and disperse a demonstration, also in the West Bank, but mainly in Gaza, without killing anyone. They said, no, then I'm not going. So this is a spread of the discipline crisis that started with Elor Azaria. Officers started to realize that they are losing control of their soldiers. Ilan, you mentioned the laboratory, testing the Israeli weapons on the Palestinian, in the Palestinian territory, in the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip. This laboratory model, a lot of scholars have studied it. We have to remember, of course, that the people who came up with the concept of laboratory are the Israeli arms companies themselves. Because when they sell their weapons, they say, we have already tested those weapons on human beings. That's how they market them. In 2006, there was an invasion of Gaza. In 2008, in 2012, in 2014. After every invasion of Gaza, there was an arms fair where those weapons were then promoted for sale with videos showing how the weapons were used in Gaza, and now customers from all over the world can buy them, also here in the Czech Republic. And this is how they were promoted. This is the laboratory model. However, what makes the Israeli military technology different than the military technology of other countries that sell their weapons? Because Israel is not the biggest arms exporter in the world. The United States is the biggest arms exporter in the world. What's the difference between Israeli and American arms technology? What's the difference between Israeli and Russian or British or German? The difference is that the Israelis specialize in occupation. And as such, they developed weapons that were specifically designed to control a civilian population. In fact, what makes the Israeli technology distinct is not its destruction capacity, but rather its capacity to repress resistance and to repress demonstrations without killing people. So look at the technology and you will see concentrated tear gas and shockers and special kinds of handcuffs and leg cuffs and surveillance cameras and biometric data machines and data mining technology in order to arrest people and of course a checkpoint architecture, things that control people but not necessarily kill them. So what happened between 2014 and today, 5 years without an invasion of Gaza? What is happening to the Israeli arms companies? Do you know that these arms companies, which have developed new weapons in these 5 years, they want to test them also. And they send these weapons to the soldiers on the border on the fence, not on the border, on the fence, surrounding the Gaza Strip. And when the Great March of Return happens on Friday and the protesters come, the soldiers leave on the side the Israeli weapons that are designed to stop the demonstrators without killing them, maybe injure them, maybe hurt them, but not kill them. Instead, they take the sniper rifles. Sniper rifles are produced by American companies, by US companies, not by Israeli companies. And they use the sniper rifles to shoot the Palestinians. They're actually disobeying orders, the soldiers. Not only are they disobeying orders, they do advertisement for the wrong companies. For the US companies and not for the Israeli companies. So the Israeli companies, if you look at their sales, the arms sales from the Israeli arms sector, they are going down after 2014. Because they cannot say that they've tested these weapons. They don't have the evidence for that. And also, more importantly, their weapons are not successful in stopping Palestinian resistance. Palestinians continue to resist. So why would customers want to buy weapons that don't achieve their goal? Why would India, the biggest customer of Israeli weapons, want systems that don't prevent people from demonstrating? When in Kashmir people are also protesting against India, then the Israeli technology is not promising very much. So the soldiers, because of the discipline crisis, which started with Elor Azaria, even before him, but this was a very symbolic moment, the soldiers are refusing to use that because they need to constantly reassure their mastery within this colonial system to say our lives is worth more than the lives of Palestinian. When the officer gives me the order, don't kill the Palestinian, I feel like I have to protect the right of a Palestinian. Why should I do that? I am superior. And they are not. So that is why the soldiers refuse those orders. That is why the weapons that they're using are the deadly weapons. That is why the Israeli weapons are left on the side and not being used, and the American weapons are used instead. And I don't know if you've seen how Palestinians have become very creative in their ways to humiliate the Israeli arms industry. Of course, the most visible ways that they do that is with kites, with balloons. They even have condoms that they use as balloons to set them across the border. Israeli arms companies were sitting and having emergency conferences to develop counter technology to the balloons and to kites, because toys are now the great threat. For the Israeli arms companies, this is a disaster. They don't want to go to the next arms fair and show their next anti-kite technology. The result of that is that they try to come up with some new drones which are especially designed to attack the Great March of Return. But the drones, if you look at them, are very similar to the kind of drones that is used by ISIS. They're actually the drones that you can order in Amazon, and they added to them something small. They're very much afraid that a real drone could fall in Gaza and the Palestinians will catch it and maybe put some very embarrassing videos online. So they prefer to send these drones that are not worth anything, but those drones they cannot export, they cannot sell them. So economically that's a disaster for them. And of course, the Palestinians have responded to these drones with their own, because it's an arms race, right? The Palestinians came up with their own counter technology, the new F-16. Have you heard of that? The new F-16 developed by Palestinians in Gaza is, they take the fishing nets that they cannot use because they're not allowed to fish, as I'm sure you know, because of the siege. They connect the fishing net to two kites, and they send them to catch the drone. Now, technically, this is the Hunter plane. Technically, I don't know how likely it is to use the kites to catch the drone with the fishing net. I don't know if it works or not, but for the Israeli arms companies, the danger of one time this happening and somebody filming it on video was enough to convince them to stop sending the drones. That would just be too humiliating. So that's why I'm saying the Palestinians are winning the arms race. And that brings me to the last point. The last point was when you said that the atrocities in Gaza always come hand in hand with the world's silence. I think the question whether the world is silent or not is not just a decision of the world. the world is certainly not a single person or a single opinion. It's also the understanding of the people in Palestine how exactly to capture the attention of the world, and how they're able to reach the attention of people all over the world with these kind of interesting gimmicks like this F-16, the new F-16 to catch drones, or with the Great March of Return, with their ability to send a different kind of message that with all of the efforts of the Israeli government to suppress it and to deny it, it's not successful. So because of this, when we look at these attacks on Gaza that used to happen every 2 years, every 3 years, 2006, 8, 12, 14, very regularly as part of the laboratory model. Israeli generals used to call it mowing the lawn, because if the Palestinians are allowed to grow too much, we have to cut them, to kill them. So no, the Palestinians don't accept that anymore. They found a way to stop it. In 2018, the Israeli government made a decision to invade Gaza again. That decision was made public. The Israeli Ministry of Defense said, we are definitely attacking Gaza. Now, it's not a suggestion, it's a decision. But the Israeli generals came to Netanyahu. They also didn't just go to Netanyahu, they also leaked it to the press, that's how I know. But they also gave some interviews to the media as well, and they said, if there will be an invasion of Gaza, things might not exactly go as we plan. And there's two levels to that message. One of them is to say, well, if we invade Gaza now, there will be a humanitarian catastrophe, there will be a lot of death, and that will not look good on the media, and also maybe we will have to take responsibility and to rescue people and so on. But there's a different level to that statement, actually, which they are denying, but you can read it between the lines. What they're actually saying, we cannot control our own soldiers. If we invade Gaza, the soldiers, like Elor Azaria, will just shoot whoever they want. And that's why there will be a humanitarian catastrophe. That's why there will be piles of bodies, because you cannot control the soldiers and you cannot tell them who to shoot and who will not. The soldiers decide they don't obey orders anymore. And in this context, Netanyahu decided not to invade Gaza. It's too risky. When Lieberman waited, Lieberman, the former Minister of Defense, waited for Netanyahu to go to France for the ceremony of 100 years for the First World War. And when Netanyahu was away, Lieberman had a press conference and said, now we are invading Gaza. Now it's happening. But the soldiers didn't move, because Netanyahu knew that it was going to happen, and he talked to the people, and it was an empty press conference, and Lieberman was humiliated and resigned from being Minister of Defense, because he understood he's not really the Minister of Defense, he's only a clown. So again, the Minister of Defense had to resign, because the ability of the government to control the army is not clear, just like the previous Minister of Defense, Moshe Ya'alon, on the case of Elor Azaria. And now the invasion of Gaza was cancelled, and there's an election in Israel without an invasion of Gaza, which is unusual, right? Because every time there was an election in the last 10 years, it was always after an invasion of Gaza, so now there's no invasion. And I think that shows that the Palestinians have understood very much about Israeli society. They understood about the internal divisions between the officers and the soldiers, between the arms industry and the populist government. They understood that invading Gaza is not so simple for the Israeli government as before. They made it no longer so simple. That is how they develop weapons of social resistance and nonviolent resistance and media, which the Israelis still did not have an answer for. That gives me a lot of hope.
Q&A. You want us to conduct the Q&A? Okay, we can do it.
Yeah, please.
Okay.
I have a question.
Yeah.
To Mr. HEVER, please. The things you mentioned about the Israeli soldiers using American weapons, although the others say otherwise, these are pretty strong claims, right? Can they be proven somehow?
Yeah. Well, first of all, we can see we have pictures of the soldiers and the snipers, and in the pictures we see either. If you look at them closely, you will see a lot of the soldiers are using the Tavor or the Negev heavy machine gun, which is actually produced by Israel. But the heavy machine gun is not a sniper rifle. So what we have are evidence of the soldiers themselves, thanks to organizations like Breaking the Silence, which are giving us testimonies of soldiers. And they specifically mentioned that the rifles are produced either by Remington or by Knight's Armament. These are two American companies, which I was able to confirm that they are indeed American companies, and they are indeed selling their sniper rifles to the Israeli government. So that is the evidence that I have for those particular rifles. And of course, a very big part of the evidence is the fact that every time an Israeli weapon is used, then we don't need to look for the evidence. The Israeli arms companies are doing advertisement for that. Even there were attacks where in Syria, where the Israeli Air Force was bombing in Syria, the Israeli government was saying, we do not take responsibility, we do not confirm that it was an Israeli attack, but by the way, the attack was done by Spike missiles produced by Rafael. If you want to buy them, this is the cost.
Thank you.
Yes, please.
First of all, I would like to say thank you to both speakers this evening. It's been a pleasure, I would like to say, to listen to you. I'd like to make a couple of points to Professor Pappé, if that's possible. First of all, you talked about the rehabilitation of Nasser, which I think is very interesting in that sense. Is it possible to sort of rebuild that sort of pan-Arab politics? Because in some ways that might take us away from the isolation of the Palestinian people. The second point I'd like to ask is that you spoke about the Israeli left using some ironic quotation marks. Can you say SHIR HEVER, when you were talking about the different political parties, you said there's no Israeli left in that sense. Can you comment on the position of the Israeli left in relation to Gaza? And then the third thing, again, Professor Pappé, you were talking about the necessity or the value of solidarity work here in Prague. And could you make a comment on what is possible for us to do in practical terms?
Yeah, thank you. First of all, I wish I had the same cup of coffee that SHIR had. I would have been as optimistic he is. But I had, probably I had downers in my coffee. I didn't, you should give me the same recipe. I would, I wish I really fascinated, and I hope you're right, because it's very promising. I still cannot see it exactly like that, but again, we'll, let's hope so. I mean, really, I mean, what one can say, but I'm afraid there are other factors there as well. But to your good questions. The first one, you know, I think that we are in a kind of a transitional period in the Arab world, and maybe for historians, it's a bit easier to see transition as a long period and not as a short one. Whereas for politicians or activists and so on, it can look like a lifetime. And because it's a transitional period, I think that there is, when it comes to Palestine and solidarity, there's always an interplay in the Arab world between the civil society or the society and the governments or the elites, the political elites. And every now and then, as happened in the decision to enter Palestine in '48, that informed Nasser's ideas of pan-Arabism that goes through Palestine and so on. Every now and then, there is a sense among politicians or political elites that they want to respond to what they think is the kind of Arab civil society's wish for their governments to do. So in that sense, yes, I think this can be repeated. I know that when you look at it right now with the position of Saudi Arabia, Oman, and Egypt, you feel that this is not, it's not repeating itself. I mean, that's solidarity. But I think if you go deeper into the relationship between the civil society and the regimes, you could see that this is still a very important issue for the interplay of legitimacy of the regimes on the one hand and expectation of the civil society on the other. And I think that Israeli politicians or strategies that feel very much on the horse nowadays, because Netanyahu was invited to Oman, because of the declaration they hear from Riyadh, because of the problems elsewhere in the Arab world, I think are mistaking this, what I call transitional period, for something that will be there forever. It won't be there forever. And I think that's the biggest, with all due respect, I mean, to the Palestinian arms race, I do think that the biggest problem for Israel is a total Israeli misunderstanding where they are, which part of the world they are, and what are the forces of change and transformation, and how long do they take, and they don't learn anything from the history of settlers movements and alien movements who try to invade, to take control, and felt that the world is at their feet and nothing can break them or change them because it's the 21st century and so on. So I think, yeah, the short answer is solidarity will be rebuilt. I'm quite sure about it. We are in a confusing moment. We had the energy that we saw in the Arab Spring, which was very much centered on Palestine as well, by the way. And that energy was wasted in a way because the people who produced that energy, for understandable reasons, did not believe in institutions, did not believe in organization, did not believe in structure, believed kind of a more an anarchist, kind of democratic way of moving forward. I think that did not produce the end result that they wanted. In a similar way, when you read the discourse between young, and you know the Palestinian society is one of the youngest in the world. So if you read the discourse, especially in the cyberspace, between young Palestinians about the future, strategies, visions, aspirations, you see the same kind of reluctance to talk about institutions, organizations, infrastructure. You can understand where it comes from, but you're worried against that this is a bit like taking water from a good source of water to another place without bottles, because you don't like bottles, you take them by the hand and you're surprised that you reach your destination without the water. So if you don't like bottles, I don't know, but take other kinds of containers, but you need containers for that. So I think this is the kind of thing that to watch for. The energy is there for that kind of solidarity, including international solidarity. In fact, I think the anti-neoliberal sentiment that the world has seen in 2008 onwards, which again was the kind of the conundrum of working against institutions without institution and losing the first phase of that struggle, is still going to continue, and Palestine will be there. Now, the other question, very shortly before I move to give it to SHIR, about, you asked about the Israeli left and so on. What's left of the Israeli left? I think, you know, for years now, I'm sure many of us have, especially those who live there, observed that one particular human phenomenon, which was a bizarre phenomenon, is going to disappear very soon. And this is the liberal Zionist, which is an oxymoron. You can't be a liberal colonialist, you cannot be a progressive occupier, and you cannot be even a socialist colonizer. You cannot have a universal set of values and surrender them for your ethnic, racist, or nationalist ideology. It doesn't work. So I think what is disappearing very quickly, now more quickly than ever, quicker than ever before, is this Zionist left, if you want. How much is an anti-Zionist left appearing or replacing it is a very good question. There are very interesting pockets of alternative kind of anti or a-Zionist, I would say, kind of pockets in the Israeli society of NGOs, civil society activists. They're not reflected in party politics as yet. And they seem to be very clear, or they have a clarity which the liberal Zionists never had, a stronger sense of purpose, I think. But they're still too small for us to assess what will be their impact. I think their impact is closely connected to movements such as the BDS and the pressure from the outside and the image of Israel in the outside world and so on, that enhances them and makes them more powerful, and for how the Palestinians themselves will define the project of liberation. If the project of liberation will be continued to be defined as Palestinians on one side and Israelis on the other side, I think that group has no chance of growing. But if we will readopt in a way the ANC model that the PLO had in the 60s, where you would say, we're not looking for coexistence, we're looking for co-resistance, then I think you're going to give purpose for these people. But it's also very difficult for Palestinians to accept Jews as being part of the co-resistance because of the model of Oslo, the model of the two states, and the partition. But this may change, because, I mean, the reality on the ground is that the two-state solution is dead, it's in the morgue, but we don't want to do the funeral yet. It will happen. We will have the funeral eventually. Your final, I remember there was a final, about what can you do here with solidarity. I think that, you know, there are so many good examples around Europe of what people are doing through the boycott, divestment, and sanction movement, through trying to influence the political parties themselves. We've seen that happen in Britain. There is no magic wand and there's no magic formula that I know and you don't know. I mean, what should be done, and it's great fun to be in Prague about this, because so little has been done here. You have so much to do still to change the public opinion in this country. I envy you. I envy you. You really start from the bottom to change one of the most pro-Israeli government, media, and politics in the world. You should be happy. I mean, you have so much to change here. I mean, I go to Norway or England where people are already pro-Palestinians, and I'm bored, and they are bored, and we have to think all the time of new things to say. You are here. I mean, I was just doing a debate at 4:30. You hear things you don't hear anymore in Europe. I mean, the most simple, simplistic, stupid chapters in the Israeli propaganda are still being said in Prague as if they are the truth or the Bible. I really envy you. I mean, you have so much to bite into. I mean, we can only nibble because we have done so much good work elsewhere. Even America has left you behind millions of years. You have a lot to do here, and it should really energize you. Really energize you. It is still one of the remaining islands in Europe, together with unenviable partners like Hungary, where kind of disguised fascism and right-wing politics are coming as pro-Israeli position. So, yeah, I hope to be bored in my next Prague visit. Thank you. Yes, please.
Well, kind of taking off from where you ended, I wonder what we can say about the international situation, and if we might look beyond. I mean, the case of Arab nationalist solidarity with Palestine is certainly an interesting case, but it was still a nationalist movement, and it had contradictions that nationalism often has, including part of the reason that there are so many Mizrahi Jews in Israel and not in the countries where they were living before, and other things. I wonder how, it's hard to predict, but from the longue durée perspective, what kind of a more internationalist solidarity sentiment can we see developing throughout the Middle East, in Israel and Palestine and in these other countries?
Do you want to answer it? It's a very good question.
Yeah, a difficult one.
Yeah. I'll come back to you.
I think part of the world that we live in today is a very complex world. We have many different kinds of different levels of solidarity movements or different kinds of messages that are given on different levels. So, for example, the kind of message that was on the Arab Spring was not a very nationalistic message, and I think it didn't completely die yet. This energy maybe have been a lot wasted, like Ilan says, but that doesn't mean that the story is completely over. I also think that part of the changes that we see with also in Europe, it's not just in the Middle East, of the rise of the populist right wing that Ilan was mentioning. We're talking about Hungary and Czech Republic and so on, but it's also in Brazil and it's also in many other countries. This populism is, I think, a reaction to a change in the way that people see the relationship between public and government, and the way that media has become decentralized to the point that governments are no longer ruling in a centralized way, but rather there is a kind of public opinion court that is sometimes more powerful than the courts of the state. And I think that is very scary for a lot of us, I believe, because it's also unknown, but there are also good things in there. And there are many elite groups that are collapsing because of it. It's not a coincidence that many of the populist leaders like to say, we are going to tear down the old elite. They're talking about one monolithic elite, but we know that, of course, there is no one monolithic elite. There are many different elite groups. And I think, let's look at what's happening in Israel as an example of this. One of the first populist leaders in the world was Netanyahu. I mean, it really started with Netanyahu and Berlusconi. They are the two, they showed the way. And after them came the Trumps and the Orbans and the Bolsonaros and so on. Netanyahu, one of the things that he really brought to the fore is the idea that the lies that a colonial society has to cultivate in order to be able to continue colonization, the kind of lies like liberal Zionism, you know, this kind of contradiction. You cannot have a colonial society without lies. And nevertheless, Netanyahu was exploring the energy that you can get from exploding the lie, from exposing it. And Netanyahu was willing to, even though he is a pathological liar, I mean, he is unable to tell the truth even sometimes when it's in his favor to tell the truth. But nevertheless, but on some deeper level, he tells the truth more than the other politicians, because he exposes the fact that the colonial project has changed direction, and it's no longer the people serving the colonial collective, but rather the people expect the colonial collective to serve them. And then the result of that is that you have a disintegration of Israeli society, and all of these minority groups, the Mizrahi, but the ultra-Orthodox, feminist groups, LGBT groups, are all starting to demand and carve their own share of the pie. And in a colonial society, of course, that's an important point to make, that you don't have rights, right? In a colonial society, in an apartheid society, there are no rights. Nobody has rights. The Jews also don't have rights. They only have privileges. So the minority groups say, we also want more privileges. And in the process of all these different groups fighting for their privileges and tearing down the collective, they're creating space for more minority groups to rise. And I think that's what we are seeing slowly, that the Palestinians now have a space that they didn't have before to demand a voice in this kind of, I wouldn't call it a democratic debate, but at least a more pluralistic debate where voices cannot easily be censored as they could before. So yeah, this is something that is happening in the Israeli society, but it's also happening all over. It's also happening in the neighboring countries to Israel, and Palestinians are aware of that, and the publics there are aware of that is happening in Israel. And I think that's one of the reasons that the right wing in the Czech Republic but also in many other countries, are pro-Israel, because Israel is offering a model of how to repress those voices. And why are the Gulf monarchies starting to be pro-Israel? Because they want the technology of repressing other voices. But the public in those countries remains pro-Palestinian because they're looking for the technology, if I'm again coming back to the arms race metaphor, the technology that challenges the repression.
I would just be worried if you sort of portray nationalism in such a generalized negative form. I don't think you meant to. And I know, yeah. But because, you know, even with the Mizrahi Jews, let's face it, when Arab nationalism was on emerging as an anti-colonialist force in the 1920s and the 1930s, Jews played a very important role with it. But they were asked by Zionism to divert their energy from liberating Arab countries to colonizing Palestine. So nationalism is both a liberating force, as you know, and can be also an oppressive one. But I think these are a concept that are constantly redefined. Even within the structure of international solidarity, even with the struggle against neoliberalism and all these targets that the classical left and the new left have kind of pointing out as important human endeavors. And therefore I think it's far more important to define more clearly the rights you are fighting for, the privilege you are struggling against, and the kind of vision that you want, and I would, this is my suggestion from where I sit, is especially in places with such a strong colonialist past, where neocolonialism is still very strong, is to try and not to repeat actually the mistake of the left in the Arab world in the 60s and the 70s, both in its attitude towards the religion and tradition, and both in its attitude towards nationalism. I think that there is something there that has to take all these concepts as far more fluid. You can always redefine them, provided they are based on shared values. And I think we're learning it in Palestine. That's my feeling is, especially among the young generation. I mean, I can see among the young generation in Palestine from the river to the sea. I'm less familiar with the situation in refugee camps in Lebanon, Syria, because I can't visit them. But where I can go, I can see a younger generation that has a different kind of dialogue between religion and modernity, between a sense of national liberation and human rights agenda and civil rights agenda. It's far more a dialogical society than a kind of the Western idea of a dialogue, that it has to lead to a solution. The dialogue itself seems to be the solution, rather than leading to a certain victory, if you want, of one set of values over the other. But it's very difficult to work it out under occupation, under colonization. And this, I think, the sorrow I feel for Palestine, especially knowing the Palestinian people. The energies there, and also among quite a lot of Israeli Jews. I mean, the energies of these young people could have been channeled to such brilliant, you know, avenues of human endeavors. But you cannot start exploiting these energies if the colonization of Palestine continues. And what we have is not just occupation. We have more than a century of colonization. And what we need is not a peace process. We need decolonization. And it's a huge question, how do you decolonize in the 21st century? You cannot take the manual book for decolonization of the late 19th century and say, okay, I know how Africa was decolonized, let me do it in Palestine. You can't. The 21st century is so different from the late 19th century. And yet, basically what Frantz Fanon also said was right, in the sense you have to decolonize the consciousness of the colonized. It's still true. It's still true. I mean, you need to make sure the Palestinians don't internalize what the colonizers say about them, frames them. You still have to decolonize them. You still have to decolonize not just the space, but also the people. I mean, these are basic truisms that are relevant to the 21st century as well as to the 19th century. How to translate them into an effective movement? You know, I'm involved in something which is totally utopic, but I hope will work. We've created the One Democratic State initiative in Palestine. First of all, not as a movement, we called it Mubadara, initiative. on purpose. We're not a movement, we're not a political party, but we think that someone has to start thinking of an alternative way forward because something is not working. And I sit there at my 65th year of life and I'm listening to 18 years old talking about the vision of the future, and there's something there that I can learn from. And I think that's the kind of thing that would put in place these interactions between what you call nationalism, what you call internationalism, and so on. It would be the realities on the ground that would give content to these ideas, and not, and I'm speaking as an academic, not academics writing articles in an abstract way. So, you see, I might have had a little bit of your coffee as well. Now that I notice, yeah. Okay.
Just a short note on the importance of independent media putting current events in important historical context and political context. SHIR, it was said here, but please know that SHIR is working for the Real News Network, which is not so very much known in Czech Republic as, for example, Democracy Now! So if you decide to follow SHIR and many other great scholars who get to be interviewed about current events on international issues, please look up the Real News Network.
I loved what you just said, Ilan, at the end, and I'd like to hear a little bit more about that. I didn't like so much to talk about the different weapon systems, you know, bought or not bought.
You're a Quaker. I mean,
but I know that's part of the conflict. So my question is, what are the dynamics in Gaza right now between militant factions, who probably are still sending rockets every now and then, and the march, the nonviolent march for return? Did I say that right? And then the other question is, what if that nonviolent resistance is successful? And historically, I'm part of the Extinction Rebellion, and there's been lots of research over the last 150 years of nonviolent movements, and nonviolent movements are statistically successful in 54% of the cases, while violent movements are only successful in 25% of the cases. And then even if they're successful, then within the next 5 years, usually they fail because of the violence which was instilled in society. So what happens? What's the scenario? What's the vision? And how will Palestinians actually, what will be their relationship towards the Israeli state if they're successful? Just try to map out some vision. I'd love to hear that.
Let me just start by saying, you know, I participated a few days ago in Nazareth, in Nasra, in a meeting between all the candidates of the different Palestinian parties for the next Israeli elections. And I was sitting there thinking whether I should tell them that I think they should boycott the election, but then I felt that's not nice. I mean, these were all new candidates for the parliament. I'm not going to sit there and tell them you shouldn't go, so I wish them all luck, and I didn't talk about the elections. But I asked them one question. I said, how are you going to engage with the state of Israel? I mean, what would be your basic departure point? And I'm talking about the younger, the new candidates, not the old ones. And the new ones said something very interesting. They said that the older generation of Palestinian politicians inside Israel regarded Israel as a flawed democracy. Namely, that they based their demands, their aspiration, the vision of the future on this majority-minority relationship within a very bad democracy, where your role is to improve the status of the minority through the democratic game, if you want, the non-violent game. And I said, okay, so this was their vision. What is your framing? And they said, no, we frame Israel very differently. We frame Israel as a settler colonial state. And we're saying to the state, you are a settler colonial state, and our demands towards you, even if we participate in the political game that you created, is towards your identity as a colonialist state. Risking, by the way, that they said it in a time where still the Supreme Court of Justice has to decide whether to allow them to run for the elections. But if you ask them a further question, so what does it mean in your politics? Does it have an impact on your participation in the Israeli parliament? Does it have an impact of how you would see the March of Return in Gaza and so on? And I don't think they went very far with it, but I think they would, if I understand. There is this kind of energy from below that I would be careful to define it totally as non-violent, because I'm not coming from your perspective, which I fully respect and appreciate. But I think that sometimes what we call violence is steadfastness, is the ability to defend yourself against a very cruel and brutal army. So I think you will see that as well. I mean, I don't know how you define it, because I participated in 3 demonstrations in solidarity with the March of Return in Gaza, in Haifa. And the police beat us like hell. And we have used our power to beat them back. We lost. I mean, the police, they are armed with the way they are armed. But I must tell you, if I would have sat there and just said to the policeman, please, here is my hat, where's your baton? Or ran away, or just defended myself like this, I'm not sure about this. No, I'm not talking only by myself, I'm talking about these young people. And what I'm trying to say, I would not lecture them at that moment about nonviolence. I would tell them that this is a popular resistance. And usually, and I agree with you, the less violent your popular resistance is, the better. I fully agree. But I wouldn't talk with absolute terms. And I think that's what I'm trying to say to you. I don't want, you know, I met a very important imam who was asked from Egypt, really a great guy, who said, people ask me, he's obviously not part of the establishment, he says, people ask me to give a fatwa ضد العنف, against violence. And he says, I'm not going to give such a fatwa. I'm not going to tell people who are colonized or occupied or oppressed that I give you a religious decree, never use violence when you are under such existential danger. I'm not, as a religious person with responsibility, how can I tell them it's you know, sacrilegious to defend yourself even with force? Now, of course, we should do all we can to create a society that doesn't need this kind of violence, but I think we should be a bit more, how shall I put it, a bit more reflexive or reflective about the usage of violence, who is using them, why they're using them, what is important at this moment is to talk about the violence or to talk about the causes that led them to the violence and so on. And I'm sure you're familiar, I mean, this is a big debate. But if you ask about the dynamics, I think the dynamics is of assertiveness, and I do hope that the assertiveness of the younger generation would be reflected in non-violent clashes. To tell you that this is my scenario, knowing the Israeli army, knowing the Israeli police, knowing even the Israeli public, you know, your average Israeli person. I don't know if you ever participated in a demonstration which is a bit on the left in Israel. I mean, you go back home, I mean, you are blue and black from all the kicks that you get both from the police and the public around you, which is not a big sacrifice compared to what the Palestinians are suffering. But within a violent situation, you have to be even more pious than Gandhi, I think, to decide that non-violence is the only way of dealing with it. Not that I morally do not agree. What I'm trying to say that the vision is for a struggle, a popular struggle. Most of it, I think, would be a non-violent struggle. I don't know how you defined a kite with a bit of a TNT on the way to a kibbutz. Would you say it's a non-violent means? I mean, the balloon is non-violent, but I don't know about the TNT, the bottom of the balloon. I don't want to get into this engagement where the Israelis say to me, you call it non-violent, and there was some TNT on the balloon. right? In this case, I like the arms race more. But so I think we have to be a bit more reflective of these issues, with everybody putting their idealistic input into it, hopefully creating a less violent, popular struggle. But I think if you ask about the interaction between the Hamas and these groups, it's not a struggle between a non-violent Palestinians and a violent military organization. That's not how I would frame it. It's between a political party with a political and religious agenda of control, of power, with an idea of liberation, and a new society, new younger Palestinian society, which exists inside Israel and the West Bank as well, that says, as I said before, that says institutions are a problem for us, and we want to do it in a non-institutional way, in the kind of a more democratic way, if you want, almost a more anarchic way. But we live in this place long enough to understand that this is not enough. So they have choices. They either can go to the Fatah and Hamas, change them from within, or they can create new institutions. And the same agenda is for the Palestinians inside Israel and also outside of Palestine. We need to Palestinians need to redefine the Palestinian liberation project and adapt it to the 21st century. But I think the basic guidelines are known for everyone. It's not that we need to invent the wheel here. The question is, will Palestinians overcome the fragmentation, the disunity, the intervention of outside powers that try to pit Palestinians one against the other, and the basic Palestinian weakness, that they are human beings who want to live normal life. How did the Misak al-Watani, the PLO charter says, the Palestinians used to live hayat tabi'iyya wa adiyya. They used to live which is so true. They used to live normal and ordinary life. Not particularly good, not particularly bad. They were not the best people and not the worst people. They just lived normal life. And Zionism's main target is not to allow the Palestinians to have a normal life. Oh, well, from the very beginning, from the first settlers who set his foot in Palestine, the idea was that the Palestinians have normal life, there is no hope for the Zionist project. That kind of formula is something that the world should have rejected already in 1882, but still too many people in the world still accept in 2019. And you cannot condemn the Palestinians for seeking all kinds of ways to bring back normality into their life. Thank you.
Maybe let me add just a few words about the issue of the nonviolence, because you mentioned specifically those numbers about campaigns that are successful, what are the chances of success, and I think it's really not our place, especially for Israelis, to tell the Palestinians, you should do this because it has a better chance to succeed or not. That's not our place. However, it is our place to analyze the Israeli interest. And for Israelis, when they can see what are the options for Palestinians to resist, of course the nonviolent resistance is the best from the Israeli perspective. And the BDS movement is something that offers Israelis the hope that Palestinians will achieve equal rights without violence, for Jewish Israelis specifically. And I think this is not just a tiny handful of Jewish Israelis like Ilan and me who are supporting BDS. I think there are a lot more people than we think, but maybe are afraid to say it, because they are just as able to understand their own interests as we are. And do you know that the Israeli Ministry of Strategic Affairs, which is the Israeli BDS ministry, under the minister Gilad Erdan. The anti-BDS ministry, but of course Gilad Erdan is doing more for BDS than anyone else. Absolutely. And this ministry dedicates 20% of its budget to activity against BDS in the Hebrew language inside Israel. Yeah. Gilad Erdan knows. Now, if you compare how this budget of the ministry is divided between different countries, it means there's only one country in the world with a bigger BDS movement, which is the United States. After the United States, the biggest BDS movement is Jewish Israelis, Hebrew-speaking Jewish Israelis. Oh. Gilad Erdan knows this. Maybe you should know it too.
Okay.
Have we got time for one more question? Would that be all right?
Yes, please.
So just on the note of BDS and the anti-BDS legislation and different steps that Israel and also America is taking, so what do you think, what do you think the impact of that will be? Do you think it's going to be totally counterproductive, or do you think it's actually going to stop people from joining, or what do you think the impact of that will be?
You mean the anti-BDS legislation in certain parts of the world?
And
yeah.
information that is being spread and
right.
legislation, but different steps that they're taking.
Well, first of all, I think if there is anti-BDS legislation, it means the BDS is succeeding. Imagine there wouldn't be anti-BDS legislation, meant we haven't been doing our job. I mean, this is the count. I mean, seriously, if you make significant achievements, if you have significant achievements, the other side will respond with all the ammunition that they have, and that's why they went to legislation if they can. So I think this comes with the territory, and those of us who were engaged in such activity in one form or another should have anticipated, and I think many of us did anticipate that this would be the reaction, including, by the way, which is the other tactic, is to defame pro-BDS activity as anti-Semitism. And as you know, for a while in the Labour Party in Britain, it does succeed to intimidate people, and it creates problem for the leader of the Labour Party and the Labour Party. So yes, the counter-activity sometimes is successful, no doubt about that. But yes, I think it is counterproductive for them in the long run, because in different countries it works in different way. In Britain, eventually they are overstating anti-Semitism, and it to my mind, will work against them. In America, legislating against, even in Trump's America, legislating against people's right to take individual act of protest is against the American DNA. Nothing to do with what you are protesting against. It's a very individualistic society. It believes in the rights of the individual to protest more than actually than the rights of the groups to protest. So I think that there are, if this would have been the only field of the struggle between Zionism, or the forces of Zionism, if you want, or colonization and the forces of decolonization and justice and peace, if that would have been the only field, I think that Israel is losing there. Unfortunately, this is not the only field, and like many of us who go back to Palestine and go to high school in Nablus, and you tell the children there enthusiastically about the BDS and how the public, Rai al-Am, the public opinion has changed in so many countries, and and they look at you and they say, but why is today worse than yesterday? And why do we know that tomorrow would be worse than today? So where is the impact of everything you tell us on the ground? So for me, I'm much less worried about, although I realize there is a price there, about the anti-legislation, the legislation and so on. I think we should weather this kind of storm. We can do this with lawyers and legal minds. We can work with this. We can. I think our biggest question is, where is the moment we can start telling people our BDS activity has an impact on the ground? And to this very moment, on the ground itself, it has no impact. I think it will have. Don't misunderstand me. I had a bit of SHIR's coffee. I believe it will be. It will be. But I think that we should really remember two things. These kinds of struggle will be countered with nasty kind of things. But secondly, we are not alone. I think the biggest thing about the BDS was the fact that, students told me in American campuses, they thought they were alone in these positions. This is now a big social network. You are not appearing alone in the court. I mean, even teachers in trade unions, I remember teachers in Germany who they thought they faced alone their high school that wanted to, I don't remember the names, but someone was to be expelled from his high school because he supported BDS. And at first he told me, he thought, who would help me? I mean, he just put it in the Facebook. And then suddenly you realize he's part of an international network that is willing to appear as witnesses in his case, that appearing to demonstrate near his school, are willing to come from all over the world to help him. And the school dropped, or the judge, I don't remember, someone dropped the charges because they suddenly understood that they're not facing this person alone. People who are supporting BDS and facing legislation or any kind of act are not alone, and they have a much more powerful network in the civil society than the people, the others. I keep telling this to the leader of the British Labour Party. He shouldn't be so timid about these accusations. I think he's a bit too afraid of them. There's no reason. There's really no reason. It's the weapon of the desperate, not the successful, to my mind. Both the accusation of anti-Semitism and this kind of legislation that says you cannot tell people to boycott someone because they're doing terrible things. It doesn't work in most moral systems, this kind of argument.
I just have a quick question. I'm just curious about your personal background and what elements of your background or path fostered this critical attitude or mindset towards the Israeli regime, especially knowing like how sophisticated like the propaganda is, and even now having heard that even public displays of violence aren't enough to shake, you know, sort of this attitude, or on the contrary, kind of make people more offended that they can't like freely express this violence. So yeah.
What made you? What made you?
Yeah, well, I think your story is much more interesting.
A lot of good coffee, very good coffee.
Yeah, no. Personally, I grew up already in a leftist family. I was taught to think critically from a young age. But what really actually made me politically active, and not just, you know, opinion is one thing, but activism is something else, is an organization of professors and students in Tel Aviv University. Ilan, unfortunately, was in Haifa, but I did meet some of your students, and which was called The Campus Will Not Stay Silent. And it's maybe difficult for us today to imagine that, but in the Second Intifada, it was possible for Palestinians with an invitation from the university to cross the checkpoint and come into Israel and into the university, even from Gaza. And we had people coming from Gaza and the West Bank to give testimonies on what was going on. And that is what convinced me to become an activist.
Yeah. I usually answer this question that it's a whole lecture, and it's a topic for a book, so I wrote a book, which is not a way of evading the answer, but you should also read the book if you want to know more. I cannot blame my family. They're really innocent. They have nothing to do with the way I developed, totally contrary to what they wanted me to be. So I have no idea where it came from. I really don't know. But I know the stations where I started thinking differently. I know the people who influenced my life. If you're really interested in this, there's a very interesting book called Out of the Tribal Boundaries by an Israeli woman called Abigail Abarbanel. And she took testimonies of 25 Israelis and Jews who did this journey to find out if there's something common in this kind of transition. And if you read the 25 kind of testimonies, if you want, you can see that it has a lot to do with Israelis who spend time outside of Israel. A lot of Israelis comes from a comfort zone and think that the privileged position they're in is a responsibility, almost a liability and not an advantage in life. And then, of course, there are the special circumstances of each story. But there must be something constitutionally right there as well to make people react the way they react to what they see, because so many other people see the same things and are not moved, don't show compassion, don't show solidarity. And I think there is a moment where you cannot go back. There's a Rubicon. There's a moment where you know it doesn't matter. Whatever is going to happen, you know too much. You know too much. And you have to win the confidence and trust of the Palestinians to feel that you are going in the right direction. And it's rightly not easily won. It's not easily won. I remember my early talks to Palestinian groups. There was suspicion. There was kind of a feeling maybe I'm hiding something, maybe I'm saying something different to a different audience. You have to be totally honest with yourself for that honesty, I think, to get out. And then I think the road is much easier. And all the time you remember that what you go through pales in comparison to what the people you show solidarity with going through. And that's very powerful. I think it's a very powerful recognition that enables you to tell your own people, you know, your own sort of compatriots, come on, what's the big price you're going to pay? And I think SHIR is right. There are many people there who are not stupid and must have the same analysis as we do. I'm sure they do. But they are afraid about the personal price. They don't want to be shunned by their own tribe. They don't want to be outcast and so on. And there is a critical mass. There's a moment, I know it from the whites in South Africa. There's a critical mass. There's a moment where suddenly you understand. And that's what happened with the BDS, by the way. You suddenly look around and say, well, we're not that few, actually. We're not that, and then it's easier to join. And I'm waiting for that critical mass to happen in Israel. I have a small story to tell you with this. I finish this, why I can be optimistic. When I moved in the year 2000, I moved from Haifa to a community center. And the local newspaper had a small ad saying, Ilan Pappé has moved to our town. Close your doors, don't let your daughters out. You know, something bad is going to happen. And my wife, was much wiser than I am, said, I know what you're going to do. I said, what? You're going to write an angry letter, making them even hate us more. I said, yeah, you're right. Basically, this was plan A. And she said, no, I have plan B. Plan B is we write a small ad in this newspaper saying that our living room is open for anyone to come to listen to you without filters and let them decide for themselves. And lo and behold, 50 people showed in our living room and stayed with us, not constantly, I mean, they left a few days, but stayed with us for 2 years. And most of these 50 people got courage from these meetings to say what they already knew. I didn't teach them anything new, but they had the courage to this kind of workshop. And one of my sons, who's very good in mathematics, said to me, you should be very optimistic. It took you 2 years to change the mind of 50 Israeli Jews. I calculated all you need is 550 years, and we'll have a different kinds of Israel. Now, I don't think we need 550 years, but I really think the critical mass is growing. I don't know if you agree with me. I think there's something in the reality, maybe something what you said about the army, and I think you're right in one thing. It doesn't have to come necessarily from a realization that accepts our moral position on the Palestine issue necessarily. It can come out from these conundrums and paradoxes that Israel is not able to solve for the ordinary Mizrahi Jew or the soldier and so on. There's something there that if we will know how to enhance it, to harness it in the right way, maybe this would be the kind of movement that turn individual stories, which are very hopeful, into something more general and collective, inshallah. Thank you.